Okay, good. Hello, everyone. I'm Luca Muvoli, the director of Mount Royal School of Art, multidisciplinary MFA here at MICA. Welcome to MICA's Mixed Media series, which brings notable art makers, designers, and thinkers to campus to fuse our community with their insight and practices. The aim of this series is to build imaginative public events that showcase the diversity of practice in our fields and the complex relationship between creativity and the world around us. Before I introduce our lecturer this afternoon, I'd like to thank all of those who came also from far away to attend this lecture, and a special thanks to all of MICA's organizations and departments and programs that have worked to prepare this event. MICA's president and provost, academic affairs, communications, and the Office of Events. Thanks to BFA Photography Department at MICA, and in particular thanks to our graduate assistants, Meghana Gavira Digari, Ben Chatag, Nina Allen, and Beth Jokelson, who, with Sandy Zohor and our program coordinator, Fan Hang, managed so many aspects in the organization of this event, and to David, Martha's studio manager. A couple of lines from the official resume of our guest today. Martha Rosler's work has been shown in solo exhibitions at various institutions, internationally in the USA, including the Seattle Museum of Art in 2016, the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2012, the Centro José Guerrero in Granada, Spain in 2009 and 10, the Centre Pompidou in Paris in 2007. I know that quite a few of our students and faculty and audience have visited the provoking Martha Rosler Irrespective, her survey at the Jewish Museum in New York, which just closed this past Sunday. Rosler has published 17 books of photography, art, and writing in several languages. She received the Guggenheim Museum Lifetime Achievement Award in 2010. A lot has been said and written about Martha Rosler as a pioneer of feminist art, as a coherent socially and politically committed artist who has been addressing and analyzing for 5 decades myths and reality of our culture, from women objectification to economic inequality, from the hypocrisy of war to gentrification, from the public sphere to more intimate everyday lives still dominated by the media. Martha Rosler works on these arduous subjects through a variety of approaches in media, including video, photography, text, installation, and performance, often using humor to unveil the mechanisms beyond the facade. In these times of self-absorption, Martha's direct approach to crucial ideas and her open discourse on our society's faults are particularly needed. A very influential artist of our times who keeps expanding the definition of art, the artist who's inspiring and connecting artists and activists. Please join me in welcoming Martha Rosler at MICA.
Hi, thanks for coming. I never know how to present about 5 decades worth of work in all kinds of media, and I'm constantly fiddling around and it's never satisfactory, so I hope you can bear with me on this, and maybe we'll pick up at the end with questions, and of course you're always welcome to take a nap. So this is just words without images to say these are some guiding principles, works in public, works that circulate outside the institutional art world or any art space, about which I'll have a little more to say. Site specificity, whether historical or relating to the present moment, and group project, collective, collaborative, or participatory, and political agitation. And to put even more words up there that you can't possibly keep in mind, there are these genres and formal categories: video and digital, electronic works, video and online, just a little redundancy, photography, projects including critiques of representation, photo montage, photo text, and photo audio works, and traditional documentary, more or less. That's because I've been butting horns with the entire concept of documentary as a epistemological and philosophical enterprise, and a practical one, since I noticed pictures on the wall. Live performances, including tours, installations, including billboards, discursive projects, textual and text plus, meaning text and other things. What, I don't know, objects, and group, collective, or collaborative projects. And even more annoyingly, there are a few thematic categories that don't align neatly with each other, but offer some perspective: housing, urbanism and the built environment, feminism, war and militarism, and historical memory. That is, these are categories essentially out in the world, which are focuses of my attention. So I'm going to start with a few works that began outside any ordinary art institution, but what has rapidly become clear is that the appetite of the art world for everything continues unabated, and things that were once outside inevitably are swept inside at an ever-increasing rate. So this is coin vortex for student debt. And if you don't know what a coin vortex is, though I think it's fairly popular in the middle of the US, it's like a lottery at which you get nothing, except you watch centrifugal forces take your penny or nickel or quarter, and somebody else gets the money, and it's usually claims that it's for charity. That's fine, but that's pretty much the story of tuition. And it's an object made out of, it's essentially a steel factured object with enameled panels, with, as I like to do, grabbing infographics with sources from the internet. And they're nice to look at, even if you don't want to know what they actually say. What's the cost of debt? And big debt on campus. And we can assume that we're tracking with the years and the ever-rising costs, and rising cost of getting ahead, which has leaped upward. And if anyone here has student loans, you don't need me to tell you any of this, but student debt has outpaced mortgages as being the greatest source and student debt, thanks to Congress, is undischargeable, which means that if you go bankrupt or die, someone has to pay those loans anyway, including your parents who co-signed if you're dead, and so on. So for something completely different. So this moved eventually into an art gallery, which is, even though it was on campus, a couple of campuses, but this was a strictly online project, solicited by Art Forum Online at just in that interregnum between the election of Trump and his ascension to Godhead. And I was to join artists in putting up a work in mourning, and this is not in mourning, it's more in rage than in mourning, is what I said. Mourning is something that I try not, I mean, my art is depressing enough often. I don't like to just actually be seen to weep or to provoke weeping. So this is a famous remark by Trump during the campaign, telling you that he could shoot someone, he wouldn't lose a single voter. So what I wanted to emphasize in this oft-quoted line is that he was literally talking about votes and comparing his support to those of his then rivals, so that it really was not about law or morality in the least, but simply about a voter base. And we've seen that it's remained pretty stable. And Rudy Giuliani, his TV lawyer, recently alluded to the fact that, it's true. He could shoot someone and it wouldn't matter to his base. But so this is a photo of him at a rally making that remark. And what's behind him are the names of people of color, largely African American, but also Native American, Latinx, and a very small number of white people, but also Arabs and so on. People of color who were shot by law enforcement without any outcome, negative outcome for the shooters. Shot and killed. So, jumping backward a few decades to the last century, a much more lightweight kind of work that circulated completely outside of any art distribution venue. It was the US Mail, and these were postcard novels. 3 postcard novels relating to women and food, having to do with labor, aspiration, social standing, and revolutionary theories, and so on. The first one is about a woman who wants to be a gourmet, and she learns to make Brazilian feijoada because that seems exotic, and also French riz de veau, another exotic, a bit of exotica. The next one is about a young woman who works in a hamburger stand, and after all kinds of escapades, from putting drugs in the food to putting spices in the food, she gets in trouble with the cooks, and then they realize they should form a union, and they revolution and take over society. The third one is based on the fact that I was living in San Diego, California, and there was a little book on the shelves. I'm from Brooklyn. So when I moved to the US, it was big, like, what? Especially San Diego. And I discovered this little book in Spanish, How to Talk to Your Maid Without Knowing Any Spanish. Homemade, M-A-I-D, and it had all kinds of strange ideas. That peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and little questions like, have you ever been to a supermarket and stuff? So I interviewed a number of the women who worked for essentially my professors. I was a grad student, and other women in the area who actually had come across to work in those jobs in San Diego, and then I translated it with a bunch of friends, and as on all of them, there's the last card tells you what the title of the series is. It's 1 card a week for anywhere between 12 weeks and 15 weeks, and the title only comes at the end. And it also was a note that if you wanted it in English, you had to send me $1.50. So to go back again, to ways to reach a public. Now, this is all very familiar, except these things were barely done, though I certainly did art, and I did not invent postcard novels, though they usually were pictures, and in that I was following my mentor, Eleanor Anton, with her great series called 100 Boots. But I was on many anti-war marches, and I was very upset by the quality of the flyers that said "Stop the War" because they appeared to be written by maniacs. They were top to bottom, side to side, with all kinds of rhetoric that looked like it was translated from some strange language which I was not familiar, and they were ripe for being tossed in the trash. So I thought I could do better, and let's leave off the words. So my father had introduced me to the Xerox machine. This is in the mid-'60s. He loved the Xerox machine. If he could have bought or married a Xerox machine, he would have one. He was a lawyer, and he would have to type his briefs in triplicate or hire sometimes more. So the Xerox solved the problem of how to make copies. So that's what I did, and the color ones were too expensive mostly, but this is basically what they looked like. And they were based on, okay, so this was in the underground press. There were a few of them. This is what they looked like. Those are these. And then as time passed, these works, which I refused to sign or date, took on a certain art worldy character, even though I actually refused to show them in the art world during the war because I thought that that was crude and vulgar and a betrayal of the pictures of people who were in the works. But they became artworks that they represent themselves in the art world now, which was not their original purpose. And this is a few of them. So I'm going back to this, and I'll show you its genesis. Most of the documentary work was from Life magazine. Here's another one with a woman holding a wounded baby. And I want to call attention to the wounded baby because it's slightly bloodied, and in these works there is virtually never any sign of blood or disrupted body parts, because I am firmly anti-expressionist and don't see the point of pummeling my audience. I can pummel you in many ways, but not by pictures that make you feel terrible. I just won't do it. This is the time to say that what they actually look like is nothing like what your projector is showing you in terms of saturation and color. This lemon drop is Pat Nixon, but she didn't actually quite look this yellow. And that's Faye Dunaway and Bonnie and Clyde in the Tondo above her. So I'll just... And what got me started on doing those was not because I had the idea to take pictures of people who were wounded or soldiers and stick them inside U.S. ideal living rooms without a preceding idea. What I'd been doing before that, which was making photo montages based on representations of women together with very similar poses from pornography or simply disruption. And that one is After Marguerite, the one on the left. And this is After Angla, hothouse or harem. So this is an entirely other series. It started before the anti-war series and it overlapped. And this is pretty much most of them. And now, 30 years later, I became part of a self-organized group of artists who realized that George Bush was going to start invading countries. We couldn't figure out if it was going to be Iran or Iraq. So it turned out to be Iraq, but along the way we also invaded Afghanistan because after all, it's from Afghanistan that the Twin Towers actually were blown up, so why not? So we had various public actions and banners. And this is studio production. I was not involved in this banner drop in the Hart office building. On TV this morning, I saw a picture of a bewildered looking Michael Cohen standing exactly in this atrium near the Calder sculpture. It's the Hart office building. And I thought, he should have a big banner. I wonder what it would say. So this is the banner drop. Again, there were several other banners aside from war, torture, and lies, and impeachment. Plus ça change. And this is a little piece that I did for magazines, patriotic Jell-O salad, that literally was a recipe taken off the internet for a patriotic Jell-O salad, but I just made some insertions, interventions into the various colored layers of what patriotism seemed to consist of in the mid-2000s. And my word to the culinary set is that after we photographed this Jell-O, I threw the Jell-O in my backyard, and a year and a half later I threw it away because I couldn't stand the idea that through 2 winters it hadn't deteriorated. Okay. And then I went back to the anti-war series. So I stopped in about 1972 or 3. And then I returned to it in 2004 because I thought it was the stupidest thing I could do as an anti-war effort on my own. And I knew that people would say to me, why are you repeating yourself? And I would say, why are we repeating ourselves? Vietnam was the longest. Welcome to the war that will be our longest war, which of course turned out to be. So they didn't paste, but what the internet allowed me to do was to grab works from elsewhere. This is mostly from the Abu Ghraib images of torture and misbehavior by American soldiers in Iraq, and some other artists, I just forget their name, Spoon something, their own versions of protest, taking popular ads for the iPod at the time, and making Iraq and George and Jeb. These colors are acidulous. So if you look at the back window, these are images by the great war photographer Anya Niedringhaus, who was subsequently killed while photographing, but it was American soldiers who had pilfered, hijacked, or borrowed Iraqi horses so that they could reenact Ben-Hur, a movie, before invading Fallujah for the first time. One thing you can be sure of whenever the US has a war, peasant clothing appears on the runways for the women. So this is from the 2000s with various images on the pillows from contemporary and other scenes, including a famous photograph by Ron Haberle of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. And in 2008, I was asked to put a cover image on a magazine that had nothing to do with me, since I'm actually not a painter. So I asked them where their logos lie, and I made something to fit. And then, of course, I couldn't stop, made a few more. And this is the model who happened to show up. So notice that this is in an art gallery because it was impossible by the 2000s to think that you could simply avoid the art world because anything is going to wind up in something relating to the dissemination and circulation of art world images. And I also felt, and would expand on this if we had the time, about the material changes in the art world and its audiences. So this is the model being photographed by her boyfriend in front of that image. This is an outdoor project, Theater of Drones from 2013. And it was in Charlottesville, Virginia. Yes, that's Charlottesville. And I'll just show you a few of the panels. I guess there were 10. And I went out of my way to include virtually every image of a drone under construction that I could find, because I wanted people, men in particular, to do what these guys are doing, which is to point to the drones. And they were kind of at child height, so there are a lot of kids pointing at drones. This is the US Predator. They don't care if the guy next to them has been shot, etc. Will they do a better job? Damn right. So these are just a few of the panels. You don't have to read them, obviously. I won't let you read them. Research and development sites, casualties, civilian casualties. A guy who appeared before Congress and said, "You're just making more terrorists, guys. I love you, but think about this." And this is before Obama, who pretty much moved into drones as the main thing. And protests. And at the Charlottesville Photo Festival, I invited the 2 local people who were spearheading campaigns against domestic surveillance. That's on the right, John Whitehead, and on the left, David Swanson, against military drones. He just said, Swanson, that is, "Yeah, I'll support Bernie because now he's against the military-industrial complex." That was the last couple of days. Before that, he wouldn't. So this moved indoors to Gijón in northern Spain. And this is in the Kunstmuseum Basel, which is where this is as well. And that's a little, a drone in sand model at the front. So once again, things that are on the outside are on the inside. This is another work in Basel. It's called Oops, Nobody Loves a Hegemon, and that's a surveillance camera video of it in the museum itself. This is a show I was in with Hito Steyrl. It just ended in January, I guess. And it's a little hard to explain, but it is called Oops, Nobody Loves a Hegemon, and it's from 1999, and it's about the US bombing of Belgrade as a supposedly a NATO exercise. It's one of the wars we tend to forget. But we killed a lot of civilians, including a whole busload. So there's a cargo, actually a small cargo parachute and a lot of little Coke and Diet Coke bottles because, as the New York Times showed on the left, we were testing this thing where we would get rid of the electrical grid in the country by dropping graphite on it. Now think about how primitive that is compared to contemporary methods of wiping out the enemy's communicative capacities in an internet era. But so we had these little Coke can size bombs with handkerchief-sized parachutes, so I just repeated that. And then this Operation Euphemism from, what does it say, 1999, I thought would work nicely for the soldiers that we've sent to the southern border. Heavily armed Americans, democracy consultant, crisis manager, something counselor. I had an eye procedure, so I'm having a little trouble reading. Law enforcement agent, border guard, paratrooper, whatever. So this is how it looked in 1999, and the reason that there's a computer there is this was the war between the Serb army, which was the Yugoslav army at that point, and the Albanian, actually Kosovan forces, who were the guerrillas. We were on the side of the Kosovans. We helped them declare a state that, I don't know what to say. Serbia doesn't recognize Kosovo, but it was a humanitarian intervention, which is how the US usually sells what it does when it wants to invade, like Venezuela. And it was considered the first war in which the two sides actually battled online. There was a significant component of propagandizing on each side. So we recreated the links, and actually by sheer chance, my intern is a Bosnian Serb, so she can read the language, so she helped. And this in Kunstmuseum Basel with the proper old-fashioned Mac, the Performa. That blank is there because I thought enough of war, and we'll look at a few feminist things. This is from the show that recently closed. It's stuffed work. That is simply about whatever you think it's about, having to do with women and bodies. This is North American Waitress Coffee Shop Variety, which is about the imaginary server and how you can tell yourself from the server on the basis of a set of characteristics. And then there's a drawing and a photograph of ideal waitresses, and then a photograph of a real life waitress. This is the recreation of actually my thesis show called The Gourmet Experience. This is also at the Jewish Museum. That was a table set for a slideshow about producers and consumers, the rich and the poor, the overly entitled and the starving, or however you want to divide hunger from excess and plenty. This was supposed to be in the show, but we couldn't find a spot to stick more stuff in that tight space. So this is a floor piece called She Sees in Herself a New Woman Every Day. And it's about a woman ruminating about a conversation she had with her mother, in which her mother was telling her to stand on her own 2 feet, but in which, like all girls, what her mother had done was to show her that she actually needed to be dependent on men. Sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction. Some videos. This is not only semiotics of the kitchen, also part of the large number of works that I did and have done and continue to do about food and women in particular, and as part of the genre invisible labor, but also the recreation of this as a group performance in the Whitechapel in 2004 with 26 volunteers who reenacted the work together with me. And I'll just remind you that the English alphabet has 26 letters, and the semiotics is a work based on the alphabet. This is another work about measurement, similar to the lingerie work, which itself is really about women and body shape and size. And it's called Vital Statistics of a Citizen Simply Obtained. And this, the parents of a child who has starved herself to death. Now, they're all also about, they all embody critiques of representation, but if I actually try to explain that now, we'll be here till midnight and you'll be sleeping. This is another one, Domination in the Everyday, about patriarchy, autocracy. It seems to be moving on. It's controlling me. Patriarchy, autocracy, and women being constantly told that they need to make themselves over. As is this, Martha Rosler reads Vogue, which is also about the labor of women in creating themselves and the labor of the mostly female workforce that makes our clothes. It's from 1982. Backyard Economy 1 and 2, which is again about women's labor in the home, largely unpaid. and another kind of labor that we call labor at the end, but it's largely unrecognized as labor until you do it for someone else. It's about surrogate motherhood and the moral, ethical, financial, and geopolitical dimensions of paying someone to have an infant for you, based on a real case. And here I'm playing all the roles, including the sperm and the baby and the judge. It is a comedy. I may be droning and groaning, but all these works have the potential to poke you and make you laugh, including the not very nice one about starved herself to death, based on the things that people will say when asked to talk about tragedy. And many works about housing, habitation, urbanism, urbanization, migration, and gentrification. So I did with Miguel Robles Duran, a friend of mine who is an urbanist. These are posters based on public-private partnerships that Europe has touted in its neoliberal way for 22 years, and they were done for Hamburg as a public project, and so far these have remained public, have not been in art spaces, except this. We're in the waiting room here for the art world. And they're based on essentially what do these promise the people who are paying the taxes. Hamburg is at the moment, Hamburg, the harbor is the largest major urban project in the world at the moment. We have the power to standardize the city. And these are about to go up on these lampposts right at the harbor. Some of the foreign businesses that were located at the harbor's edge protested to the city about these. And they were told, it's art. They were also in buses, these projects. So why aren't they in German? Because the curator, who is German, said they need to be in English, because English is the lingua franca, or we should say lingua anglica, of the world of commerce so far. So one of these photographs committed suicide here. But I've done a lot of work about spaces of transportation in which human beings are caught up in being on their way else, whether long-term, that is long flight, a long passage, or short-term as in a subway or metro and car. But I think I'm only showing airports because, once again, I don't really want you to fall asleep. I first started thinking about air travel when I became an itinerant worker myself in the 80s, when the art world internationalized. Before that, it wasn't, especially because those of us in America tended to speak only English and most of Europe did not. But as groups started either recognizing the existence of one another, especially feminists, they were among the first that I know of to invite other feminists from other countries to participate, but also the flow of video, very easy to transmit, and the rise in literacy in English in other countries proceeded, and I began, like many artists, to be invited to go elsewhere. And normally I couldn't have afforded to fly, but I was being sent by plane, and I discovered the airport as a world apart that was nothing like the way we normally divide up and understand the world. that it's not about linearity, but about a certain kind of nodal relationship where you might fly to Chicago in order to get to Baltimore if you're coming from Maine, which doesn't make sense except for the corporations that are engaging in your travel. And it also, these are the two signature images. The one on the left was Saarinen's great TWA terminal, now about to be a luxury hotel at Kennedy Airport, which represents flight as utopia. And as a kid, we used to go out and look at it, going to the airport simply to revel in the glory of this thing that we never expected to take part in. And on the right, also from the 80s, is an image in a subterranean corridor at O'Hare Airport in Chicago, which was then the largest airport in the US, and of course a major hub. Maybe there's a substitute for experience, which is an ad for the wall, and what it's about is the free flow of capital, which is extremely appropriate because we are in the quintessential era in which capital flows freely and labor is constrained by borders. And it's that precise fact that drives so many of the right-wing tendencies in this country and in Europe and elsewhere. These colors are terrifying. And there are three layers of text. One at the bottom begins with the way that we normally would see, not this particular corner, but it starts a tree, a rock, a brook, and then it names landscape, it names other ways we set up geographic routes and boundaries and social institutions around spatiality on the ground. And then it goes into the ones above that point to the postmodern nature of the spatiality of the airports and the system of transport, including there are only no fragments where there is no hole, and I don't say map, I don't say territory, and various phenomenological relationships to the body, which always happens to us when we enter architectural spaces where we're somewhat lost. We become thrown back onto our relationship to our bodies, boulevard or intestine, vagina or birth canal. And the smaller ones relate to the airport as a space, of course, of terror and surveillance after 9/11. And this is the airport exhibit at the back in GAM in Torino in Italy. And on the floor are a series of route maps of primarily women in the sex trade from Nigeria up to Torino, where much to their surprise, they were not going to get jobs as clerks and secretaries, but rather as field whores, and most of them were teenagers, which was very disturbing and terrifying, since they were sent there by women who appeared to be family friends, and also some men, also from sub-Saharan Africa primarily, who also migrated north, but not for the sex trade. So I had the maps on the floor of where they had, how they had entered Italy and from where. And I had testimony from the parties. It was translated into proper Italian and read by actors, once again, because I wanted to distance the affective relation between the audience and the speaker from any judgment or figuring of them as particular people other than as their biographies as they chose to impart them. And they were played on the spikes. We called them sound showers. I don't know what they're actually called. Overhead, various spots. This is a very different kind of show about housing and homelessness, urbanism, and so on. This was at the Dia Art Foundation. So the GOM show was 2010, I think. This is 1989 when I first realized that homelessness was not only a major problem in New York, but was a major problem in every city that I visited, and that we had not had a flood of homeless people in any way like that. And I grew up in New York, so I was especially concerned. So there were 3 exhibitions and 4 public forums. And much to my surprise, this show, which got very little attention except from people, but nothing from the press, has since appeared in many forms in many countries between 1989 and 2016, sometimes with a different title, including in Taiwan, Utrecht, Barcelona, Liverpool, Berlin, Vienna, Basel, Rotterdam. These are just some from the first 3 shows. I worked with this group of self-organized homeless people who called themselves Homeward Bound Community Services, who held a vigil in City Hall Park in New York City for 120 days. And I would meet with them and with my wonderful assistant, Dan Wiley, who is now Congresswoman Velasquez's assistant, and asked them what they would like. Would they like to be in the show? Yes. What would you like? An office in the gallery. So that's them on the right, and they're having a workshop on the left, and that's some of their members above. And I worked with the Madhausers, which was, again, a self-organized group of young graduates in architecture and design who had probably worked in the Samuel Mockbee studio. They went to Auburn mostly, and they built huts with and for homeless people, largely men, on waste spaces in Atlanta, and helped them transition towards social services. And that's Homeward Bound pretending that they have to now live in this hut, which is in the gallery. And this is a hut being built in Dumbo, Brooklyn, down the block from where I lived. It was a derelict warehouse area at the time for these 2 guys. And this is work by some squatter artist. That's your president, should you care to acknowledge him. And these are various works by the Bullet Space Art Collective. The only image of a person lying on the street was from a project by students at Otis Art Institute in LA. And this is a work at the top by homeless men. This is a few more works. There were 50 plus artists. These are works by homeless people. This is my work. I think the only photo montage I made in the 80s. There were quite a number of photographers. This is just a selection. And this was from the Taller de Artistas Fronterizos, the border art workshop in Tijuana and San Diego. And it was a coffin filled with dry ice. And there was a reading room in each of the shows. And this was Dia's land holdings, real estate holdings at the time, which elicited a bit of hysteria on the part of Dia, but with a smile. They were nice people. And this was a 1-minute animation that I did in Times Square completely by chance. I was invited to do part of their messages to the public, and this is just a few of the frames about homelessness at the time. This is a partial reconstruction at the Reina Sofia. This is a book that I did with Dia in 1990. based on the project, and then a book on essays I've written about urbanism and art in 2013 called Culture Class, and its translation into Spanish. And then the show also had a few rounds as essentially an archive show in Utrecht, in New York, Utrecht, and Barcelona. Anyone who knows Catalan should recognize. I think it's in Catalan. There was always a symposium or more with each of the shows. And then there was one in Seattle that was supposed to take a year. This story is long and complicated. Seattle was a victim of Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. Amazon, Microsoft, and not Google. So it was supposed to be a year devoted to the project. The sponsors shut it down in the middle. So I had to sort of restart it in New York, but I certainly wasn't going to do a show about Seattle and New York. So I invited many of the people who'd been in the 1989 show to rejoin, and they did, and also many current people whom I knew were working on these issues. It's the list of participants there. We called the space Temporary Office of Urban Disturbances, and Miguel Robles Duran was also involved in particularly putting together the public portions of this. The slogan is the slogan of the first show from 1989, which was by the then Mayor Ed Koch: "If you can't afford to live here, move." Yeah. So many of the things that are visible here are from the original show, but many are not. Many are from 2016 when this was made. A couple of the forums. My co-conspirator Dan Wiley in the corner. And it's been in all the shows. It's Seth Bachman, spatial deconcentration, which is a phrase from the 70s, also known as the war against the poor, and ends by asking, what are people going to do about it? I'll quickly go through some works about Greenpoint, which I moved there when it was the land that time forgot, and it was very polluted. So this was a work about activism and fight back in Greenpoint. And this was 2011. Greenpoint is now Williamsburg North, which means it's the site of very hot gentrification, and it's conversation with some of the newer and older first, and newer people that I've interacted with and buy from and knew personally in my immediate neighborhood in Greenpoint, including Eat at the Top, which was the first locavore hipster place in Greenpoint, and everyone was agog, and then they disappeared, poof, and it's now a doggy boarding place and Greek diner, and these are the hipsters, and Cafe Grumpy, which is 3 blocks away from me. There are a lot of panels in that work, and these are just some of this is like a little primer on how to tell the difference between the old school and the hipster, which is kind of a bit of a joke, but it's pretty clear. So obviously this is the old school, basically working class place, though Peter Pan there has a new gentrification sign for itself. And these are hipster places which pretend that they don't care, except for the inevitable sandboard. And then Carmine's closed, Eat closed, Paradise Florist is still there. That's because the Poles haven't left, which is interesting. And Pit Stop, which is on my corner, is gone, as is Cheap Charlie, which is very, very sad. This is them at my recent show. Because I have something silly, but it's true. I often don't show photography when I go through these things because often only photo people care. But I am going to show you some photography. This is a work called The Bowery and Two Inadequate Descriptive Systems. And of course, it is a conceptual artwork, which is a direct critique of the tradition of photography, but it also inevitably is photographs of storefronts at the lowest point in New York City history, which is the mid-1970s before gentrification hit. And it is a critique of what it is that documentary tells us, particularly when it's a documentary supposedly about a famous Skid Row inhabited by drunks and bums. People think this is a work about homelessness. We didn't have homelessness in 1974. The men who would normally be pictured hanging around drunk lived in the single-room occupancy hotels that lined the Bowery, which were subsequently closed and turned into high-end artist lofts or simply torn down for hotels and so on. I have a work about that too called Bowery Highlights, but I'm not showing it. So in other words, this is not a work about real estate. This is a work about the construction of a landscape of meaning by virtue of photography. But the work is called, I'll get to that in a second. Each image except three, each panel is of 24 is paired of text and image paired together, though they are unrelated. And they relate either to drunkenness or to drunks. They are quotations of a particular American style of documentary, often associated with Walker Evans, but certainly not only, from the 1930s. And the title of the piece is incorporated. It's called The Bowery and Two Inadequate Descriptive Systems, because I've used language as a supplement to the visual image, but without any suggestion that the linguistic element is any more capable of presenting a social reality than the photographic is, which I think is something, as I kind of alluded to, I wrestle with constantly, especially since we rely so much on documentary evidence in every way, from the buttons that we buy online to evidentiary elements in social protests against predatory behavior and also in court cases and so on. This is my notebook of possible words. This is, again, a particular installation of this piece. This happened to be in Documenta. And then quickly some actual documentary, which I shot in Cuba in 1981. I did not process the film for 10 years, except the color work. And then I didn't show it for at least another 10 years after, until my gallerists insisted that I show them. I didn't know the color ones existed, but then I said, but then we have to show the color works. So I'll just show some of these. This is Cuba 1981, at a pivot point between the election of Ronald Reagan and his assumption to godhead, very much like that Trump moment where you know the world is about to, as you know, it is about to end, and it did. And these are also pairs, and thanks to my curator, who's actually an artist, Alta, I did a show in Barcelona called 1981, the year the future began, which had to do with the new relationship between the US and Latin America, and also he's a photo historian and a photographer. So there are lots of documents about 1981, but also some of the Cuba photographs, photographs from May Day 1981 that I shot in Mexico City, where I was attending a colloquium on photography. And then I flew back and got on a bus from New York and went down to Washington, D.C. to be part of a march on the Pentagon against budget cuts and against intervention in El Salvador, the use of which it's extremely useful to remind people what the state of protest and organization was in 1981, and also the relationship to the invasion and covert war in Central America in this case. I was really sick when I took these, so don't criticize me. All right. This is a Super 8 film about sweated labor in the fields called Color Field Painting. This is a video, this is to balance the feminist video, called Secrets from the Street about San Francisco, where I lived in the Mission District. This is called A Simple Case for Torture, or How to Sleep at Night, which is a 60-minute barrage of information, but no images of torture, based on an article in Newsweek magazine saying we ought to torture people, which at the time was not a nice thing to say in the US, and now it's perfectly fine. If it's too bad to be true, it could be disinformation, which is about Nicaragua and the US and the threats to overthrow it. That's it as an installation. 1-minute clips about Native Americans in Seattle for broadcast television in 1991-3. There were 11 of those. Chile on the road to NAFTA, accompanied by the National Police Band. This is long after this is 1997, so long after the overthrow of Allende in 73 that Americans didn't remember a thing about it and the role of the United States in that overthrow, particularly Nixon and Kissinger, which looks a lot like what's happening in Venezuela, except that Chile was not collapsing. And this, which is something I cannot finish. South Africa, crossing the river without a bridge, shot just after the end of apartheid in South Africa when I went there with the permission of the African National Congress to work with community video people and teach at the University of Cape Town for a couple of months for a summer and interviewed people. And this is exactly what it says, and I'm almost done, so perk up. This was the show in the atrium of the Museum of Modern Art in largely, I'll get there, in 2012, but it started as two shows. One sale in 1973, that's me up there in hippie dress in San Diego, and then one in San Francisco in 77, and that's the lower right. That's the performance artist Barbara T. Smith. And then another show that I thought would go nowhere, and I didn't intend anywhere, and yet it's been to 10,000 places as shopping has moved to the center of the art world from formerly being that which cannot be named. So This is MoMA. What you see is what you see. If anyone's awake, you should be laughing. This is, we sold an old Mercedes. MoMA had a fit. I had to sign a separate 14-page contract over the removal and liability of a vehicle. They said, we don't have that here. And I said, you mean the Ferrari that's on the wall or the Bell helicopter that's hanging right over us there? And they said, well, they don't have engines. I said, welcome to this suitable for biodegradable Mercedes, which has no engine. You still have to remove it. Actually, people were lining up to buy it because it was biofuel capable. And while people were waiting online, they could read one of these two communist newspapers that we produced for the show. And I had traveling library, works about books, Hannah Arendt, no pictures, just texts based on first George Bush and now our president. Totalitarianism and power invariably replaces all first-rate talents, regardless of their sympathies with those crackpots and fools whose lack of intelligence and creativity is still the best guarantee of their loyalty. End of story. So that was the main show. This is the show, which I can't resist showing you a little of. There's nothing like super wide angle to make everything look clean and huge, but in fact, it was a fairly compressed space. And this was on Sunday, the end of the show. And now, I will now end with a little video if we can figure out how the hell to get there. At last! That's not it, though. Data and bad data. I lost the, hey, you're supposed to show me your little bar. Where is it? I'm gonna have to back out again, I guess. Technology is not our friend.
Now we will determine if you're in the Rose Garden, and it should not be a surprise if he is in fact moving forward. All signs point to pulling out of this Paris climate.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice President of the United States.
Good afternoon. Secretary Mnuchin, Secretary Ross, EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, members of Congress, distinguished guests, on behalf of the First Family, welcome to the White House. You know, it's the greatest privilege of my life to serve as Vice President to a president who is fighting every day to make America great again. Since the first day of this administration, President Donald Trump has been working tirelessly to keep the promises that he made to the American people. President Trump has been reforming health care, enforcing our laws, ending illegal immigration, rebuilding our military. And this president has been rolling back excessive regulations and unfair trade practices that were stifling American jobs. Thanks to President Trump's leadership, American businesses are growing again, investing in America again, and they're creating jobs in this country instead of shipping jobs overseas. Thanks to President Donald Trump, America is back. And by the action the President will announce today, President Donald Trump is choosing to put the forgotten men and women of America first. So with gratitude for his leadership, and admiration for his unwavering commitment to the American people, it is now my high honor and distinct privilege to introduce to all of you the President of the United States of America, President Donald Trump.
I think what we'll do, most of you know most of the people around the room, but I'm going to start with our Vice President. Where's our Vice President? Our Vice President.
Thank you, Mr. President. And just the greatest privilege of my life is to serve as Vice President to a president who's keeping his word to the American people and assembling a team that's bringing real change, real prosperity, and real strength back to our nation.
Mr. President, I'm privileged to be here. Deeply honored, and I want to thank you for keeping your commitment to the American workers.
President, what an incredible honor it is to lead the Department of Health and Human Services at this pivotal time under your leadership. I can't thank you enough for the privilege that you've given me and the leadership that you've shown.
On behalf of the entire senior staff around you, Mr. President, we thank you for the opportunity and the blessing that you've given us to serve your agenda and the American people, and we're continuing to work very hard every day to accomplish those goals.
It's been a great honor to work with you. Thank you for the strong support of HUD and for all others around this table that I've worked with.
I want to congratulate you on the men and women you placed around this table, but the holistic team of working for America is making results in each and every area. This is a team you've assembled that's working hand in glove for the betterment of America. And I want to thank you for that. These are great team members, and we're on your team.
It was a great honor traveling with you around the country for the last year, and an even greater honor to be here serving in your cabinet.
Mr. President, it's a privilege to serve the students of this country. I want to thank you for giving this country an equal opportunity.
It's an honor to be your steward of our
Thank you for the opportunity to help fix the trade deficit.
President, thank you for the opportunity to serve at SBA.
Mr. President, thank you for your support.
It's an honor to be able to serve you.
So this is how it's going to work today, since I'm here and I get to call on you. If you want to ask a question, I think it's only fair, since I've shared what I'm thankful for, that you start off with what you're thankful for. So anybody want to be first on what they're thankful for? April, you've been so eager, so I'm going to go with you to start us off on what you're most thankful for.
I'm thankful for life. I'm thankful for my children. I'm thankful for 20 years in this job. I'm thankful to be able to talk to you and question you every single day.
I feel the gratefulness there.
Mike, like to say a few words?
Well, I appreciate it, Mr. President. As I told you last night, shortly after the Senate vote, I know I speak on behalf of the entire cabinet and of millions of Americans when I say congratulations and thank you. Thank you for seeing
through the course of this year an agenda that truly is restoring this country. You described it very well, Mr. President. From the outset of this administration, we've been rebuilding our military, putting the safety and security of the American people first. You've restored American credibility on the world stage. We're standing with our allies. We're standing up to our enemies. But you promised economic renewal at home. You said we could make this economy great again. And you promised to roll back regulation. And you signed more bills rolling back federal red tape than any president in American history. You've unleashed American energy. You've spurred an optimism in this country that's setting records. But you promised the American people in that campaign a year ago that you would deliver historic tax cuts. And it would be a middle-class miracle. And in just a short period of time, that promise will be fulfilled. And I'm deeply humbled as your vice president. Mostly, Mr. President, I'll end where I began. And just tell you, I want to thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank you for speaking on behalf of and fighting every day for the forgotten men and women of America. Because of your determination, because of your leadership, the forgotten men and women of America are forgotten no more. And we are making America great again.
Thank you, Mr. President. God bless you.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening news and dance. I can read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. His truth, his day is marching on.
If you'll turn off the house lights, I can stand away from this thing, which made me feel like a dwarf, and actually talk to you, if you like. These things are not designed for short women. I think the end of the 60s and the onset of Reaganism and neoliberalism put an end immediately to any kind of meaningful protest for a number of reasons, some of which had to do with the shape of the US government and the effort toward Congress to remain a functioning bipartisan body when they had a wrecker who was finally elected, whose sole aim was to destroy the government. He's the guy who came in and said the worst words in the English language: "I'm the government, I'm here to help you." So since I'm from the era when activists didn't vote because it was considered a force in the streets that was different and not part of the you couldn't be distracted by being engaged in electoral politics because, as Nader pointed out, this is two branches of the same party, though we have now switched to an electoral model since it no longer works to ignore. It took a while to figure this out. And we're in transition now to an entire other model of how to be an activist and how to be many things. But all those protests, artists were involved in, obviously not the May Day workers. You have to say, if you know anything about Mexican politics, of course, the unions were largely union capture by the state, but that didn't make them afraid to, their signs were asking for real living and living wages, and there were women's sections and so on. It was under the institutionalized Revolutionary Party, so those are workers, but I was there as a photo person in a photo conference of artists. But all the people that I was with on the bus down to Washington and who I was marching with, I removed a lot of the pictures of the various art. There was a huge amount of artistic agitation and activity in the art world up through this. Now I'm talking about everywhere, but I moved back to New York from California in the 80s, so mostly I know the 80s in New York, and there were many, many activist works that were ignored by the art world, the capitalized art world, that is the financial art world, that was rebuilding itself thanks to a couple of dealers, including Mary Boone, who imported gigantic neo-expressionist paintings from Europe and also promoted a few neo-expressionist American painters, David Sally and Julian Schnabel and Enzo Cucchi and so on from Europe, to try and discipline the art world in New York, which was engaged in all kinds of unseemly activism and real estate shows and collab and Carnival of Desire, which was about reproductive choice. So, and political art political art distribution and something, and documentation and repo history, putting up signs all over New York explaining what the areas that were now tourist areas, what their actual history was, which wasn't always so nice, obviously, and fashion moda in the South Bronx. So there were many artists involved in non-capitalizable and particularly performance-based or installation-based actions, and street graffiti, which doesn't include Mr. Basquiat, who became the capture, but something very different. So I think I'm answering your question, but I'm wandering, so.
Do you think artists are effective activists today?
I do. I think Occupy. Those are my knees. I wrote an article called The Artistic Mode of Occupation, which the last sentences, they say gentrify, we say occupy. So artists were heavily involved in the Occupy movement in many places, and that's for the obvious reason. Artists often don't have settled jobs, and so they can kind of, but also the idea of creating an encampment and living with few resources is a typical artist thing, but also just the idea, the preservation of the horizon of utopianism is still the province of artists. And I think this is crucial. And one of the interesting things is that what neoliberalism tells you is you don't dare to dream. You go to school, you get a job. It's a certificate granting place. Of course, it's stupid to say this in an art school, and yet everybody knows that that's supposed to be what school's about. Certificates of earning power. I was in the Kochi Biennale this past December, and some artists who worked in Korea came up to me. One of them was an American, his partner is Korean. And he said, how do you do it? How do you do it? I said, do what? He said, survive. I said, you don't think I survive by selling my work? And he said, you need to call my mother. And I said, what? Your mother thinks you should be directing your efforts to making a living through your art? And he said, of course. I said, well, I'm sorry. I can't help you there. If you can, you can. That's great. And if you can't, you have to decide whether you will try and draw your income from somewhere else, because you don't want to stop what it is you do. So, you know, there's market artists and non-market artists, and I'm here to say, you have to decide. In my day, of course, there was always the likelihood, or the possibility of a teaching job, even if it paid terribly, or if you were an adjunct, at least it existed. Now you can't tell people entering graduate school that you're going to come out with the ability to teach, because, yeah. Right. So I would say that it's not that artists have the license on the political horizon of another world is possible, but certainly that is a lot of what artists do, is try and think in those terms or engage in critique that is implicitly about another world is possible. How's that for a little essay? I'm not going to be the one to call on people. It's who can yell the loudest.
Well, I can yell loud.
I can hear it.
Following on that question, and if you don't want to talk about this, just please don't. I know that artists right now, artists who recently found out that they are invited to participate in the Whitney Biennial are organizing to figure out how to contend with the reality that the board of directors at the Whitney has a tear gas manufacturing primary interest, and so artists are organizing to decide how they can be in the Whitney Biennial under those conditions, and in fact, Michael Ratowitz has made the decision to just simply not be in the Whitney Biennial, which is a huge move for an artist, I think. It's hard for some people. It's hard for many artists to make that decision. I mean, I think anyone.
Yeah, maybe. So I I was invited to be in the Venice Biennale in 2003, and I was teaching in Stockholm and Copenhagen, also flying once a month to teach at Yale. So I invited all my students to be in it, and we did collective projects, but I insisted on my own personal, we built a building and we had performances and banners, and my banner said the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Dissent. It was called Trojan Horse because the artists had withdrawn from the Venice Biennale. And I said, maybe it would be better simply to refuse. And one of the things I was pointing out to them is that, because everything's about teaching, right? First of all, people don't remember this. And also that artists have, in many cases, shuttered their work, or Carl Andre, I remember, pasted something over his work. Artists are refuseniks. Artists are non-compliant. And the idea, I mean, great for Michael Rakowitz, but it's your way of talking about it that I found a bit disconcerting. First of all, no is sometimes stronger than yes. No is sometimes stronger than yes, and this is always a problem for institutions that try to censor people because it usually makes their career. I'm not accusing Michael Rakowitz of doing a career move. I'm just saying, let's think about what refusal is and how many times artists have said, F you, I'm not complying because I don't like you and your institution. I mean, on the other hand, we can remember what happened not to Hans Haacke, but to his curator, Edward Fry, I think his name was, at the Guggenheim, for putting up work that talked about the dirty dealings of people on the board, and that was 1970. So the show got canceled because he wouldn't agree to remove those works, but his curator got fired. Of course, Hans expected to be blacklisted forever, and in a way he kind of actually was. So I just want to say presentism is a problem. It's the thing I most argue against. Do not make the mistake of casting what's happening now as the first time in history that something has appeared. And if artists want to either join Michael Rakowitz or not join and do something else, that's their choice. I just think that if they choose to say he's our hero, that's fine, but that's, I'm too old to have that kind of like, oh my God, nobody in the history of the world has ever refused to be in an important show.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
I don't mean to attack you, but it's useful.
I don't mean to hold my breath as the right decision or the only right decision or the first time that anyone has done that. I really was just interested in more the people who stay in the show and are now organizing together. And I think
Well, he's sort of made it impossible for them not to, which,
they had already started doing that before Michael made that.
well then, that's called showboating. And I don't mean to attack Michael either. It's just that I'm pulling against your narrative because it's very congealed, and I'm a contrarian, and I would like to see a little bit more context of the story. I think it's great that artists are non-compliant, but we need to understand the various consequences of moves like that. Sometimes, as in Hans's case, they wind up destroying the curator, whatever, you know. But also, let's not treat it as a singular act of a meteorite crossing the sky in a way that no one's ever dreamed of before. At the Kochi Biennale, a number of artists refused to participate because one of the organizers had been accused of sexual assault and it had not been dealt with. And during the presentation of the Guerrilla Girls, with their permission, a group of young artists from the area, most of whom, I think none of them were actually in the show, and critics got on stage and did a group performance of reading various things about this and trying to publicize this and demand that the Biennale structure take account of the complaints of women about this person. There are many ways to intervene, and some of them, people have locked the door on their own show who aren't Michael Asher doing it in order to point out commerce. I don't think that was Michael Asher though. But all right, enough. I've beaten that horse dead.
Couple more questions. Are there subjects that you find to be almost untouchable?
Are there subjects that you find to be somewhat untouchable in the art world? Is then if you approach that subject, you're not going to get a show. Artists are afraid to approach that subject because there's too many varying opinions. You've been afraid to approach the subject, for example. I'm thinking particularly of Ilhan Omar, representative of Minnesota, recently making comments against Israel and having to apologize for her anti-Semitism, which, or not against Israel, against the AIPAC funding it. True. And I wonder if there are certain subjects that are almost blacklistable still.
Yeah, anything that some curator in Seattle got shut down because the person who gave me a big grant and owned the space realized that I was talking about real estate in Seattle. What did she think? She's friends with the mayor, what can I tell you? So, of course, I was, unfortunately, she also fired the curator and all the staff. But there's always something that someone's going to object to. At the Jewish Museum, at the press conference, the people from the Israeli embassy came over and looked deeply into my eyes. And I thought, the last time I saw this was in Cyprus, where the British ambassador and the American ambassador each did that because I was going to be doing a project on spying. Cyprus is a huge spying hub for the U.S. Russians just want their money there, but the Americans. It so happened that that show itself got closed in a huge lawsuit. So that didn't happen, but that thing of looking deep into your eyes to say we're going to get that. But like I said, artists aren't compliant. That would be me. So, you know, whatever. But there are always going to be things that you don't imagine. However, we have enormous. The elephant in the discussion is what about the question of ownership of narrative of victimhood, which is too complicated to talk about right now, but I've been thinking of trying to write something about it, but so many people have actually written about it. I would just like to remind everybody that the professional stakes involved in the arguments in the art world do not necessarily accord with how things work in the real world. So narrativity is not just owned by the art world and by artists, but also by people and communities. So there is often a strange disconnect. And yet, you ask yourself, so let's say you're facing something that you think is worth talking about or writing about. You need to consider whether you are the right person. Maybe you should work with somebody or just seed the ground. And I think that can range from completely honorable to completely dishonorable or cowardly, but that's, this is, life is complicated. Did you have anything else in mind? By the way, I do want to point out again that Ilhan Omar, right, yes, she has every right if she wants to say something about the state of Israel, but in fact she was talking about Congress being bought by the extremely generous grants from the American Israel Public Affairs. And to call her an on those grounds is a bit rich. We can't hear back here. Oh, I can't help it unless there's a.
Well, can we read your knees again?
How's this? I thought this came. Oh, I saw that hours ago. Stop the fun now. Let's get serious. Is this, ooh, I don't have to yell. What's happening with that light? I might have to go away from that light, though. I'll have to go back in the corner. That light will destroy me. Okay, let's, ooh, big blind spot.
Oh, it's really loud. I had a question. You kind of just,
I don't know where you are.
I'm right here.
Oh, hi, okay.
You kind of just touched on this, and I'm just interested, you talked a little bit in your collages from the Vietnam War about like representation and not wanting to include really graphic imagery. And in a lot of your work, you use words to kind of tell the story instead of directly showing the story. And I'm interested maybe in today's context, if that's changed with how many images we see, or if you feel more strongly about that.
Neither.
Okay.
First of all, I do what I do, naturally influenced by the context of the moment. But by the time I was born, we lived in a world that was overflowing and completely awash in images. As I was explaining the other day at my show about the Bowery, I was trying to explain why, in my opinion, conceptual art is dead at the moment. It's because conceptual art was very specifically anti-visual. It was pro-rational, anti-expressionist, anti-visual, but the reason for that was a response to the dual assault on a certain high-minded art by pop art, which after all stems from a genius who worked as a lowly shoe illustrator and set designer, lowly in terms of the high and the low at that time, but also the assault on the art world, field, domain by mass media and advertising, which are heavily visual, even though McLuhan would tell you that television was a sound medium, but which at the point it kind of was. Nevertheless, what visual arts did at that time was to subtract as much of the visual as possible, basically as an experiment in mentation and narration. And there is no moment today where people want to be asked to think in quite the way that conceptual art was asking people to think. Instead, they are presented with a kind of narrative about identity that plays on certain well-known, already narrativized points. So obviously conceptual art is in an entirely other realm. So to say we're in a highly visual universe, it's like one of these things you could write on a fortune cookie and put it away in a drawer for 30 years and take it out and then say, yeah, that's true of now. That's because it is true, but it's been true ever since advertising could find its, I mean, the idea that advertisers were painting pictures on the sides of buildings in the late 19th century is astonishing, and yet they were. They were going to get that picture in your brain no matter what, and then a little slogan and whatever. There are also too many words. So, there's probably, we suffer from narrative pollution, I think, a lot more than we suffer from visual pollution. That we can like shut our eyes, but we can't shut our ears. What's the internet? It's not a bunch of pictures coming at you. It's endless words.
nonstop words, 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 telling you how to think, what to buy, what to read, what to own. So no, I don't know how to end this. Can we call a truce?
I feel like throughout your lecture, I can see two themes, which in no way encompass your whole work. But one of them for me is the kind of collapsing the public space into private space, like your works on feminism or anti-war or about transportation or even about housing. But then there's also these groups of works that are about modes of representations, like pictorial representations or textual representations. And I'm wondering if you in some way connect them. That's my question.
Well, first, thank you for your sharp observation. I would agree with you. I would say that since, I don't know, since I was really pretty young, I understood that the private and the public sphere are, which as it came to us through Victorianism, and certainly American culture, but also much of European culture, the home is the haven in a heartless world. That's a literal 19th century Victorian phrase in which the private is carved out as very specifically apart from, separate from, and a refuge from the predations of the public world, but that in fact they are mutually dependent. That for a long time I tried to figure out which created which. Did the private create the public? Did the public create the private? And then I thought, silly girl, they rise and fall together. Right now I would say that like an egg that's been smashed and the yolk broken, everything is all a jumble, and that it's very difficult in particular because of the flattening caused by the internet. But I also want to point out that we invented the internet, it didn't invent us. And I first noticed the oddity of the complete, and here's a loaded word, penetration of the two when during the reign of the first old king that we had, which is Ronald Reagan, there was this moment where people were suggesting that maybe he wasn't really healthy, and they showed pictures of his colon or something like what, they were diagrams, on TV, and I said, oh, so now we've reached the point where we have to be exposed to images of the colon of the President of the United States. Woe betide. So we can make a contrast with the fact that the French believe that private behavior is strictly private and has nothing to do with the public life of public servants. We don't agree with that in the least, but it would be nice if there was some balance. But I mean, if you think about what happened to poor old Bill Clinton and the fact that now people are saying he should have resigned because of his affair with an intern, which always makes me laugh. I mean, the fact that people who were absolutely adamantly opposed to any such silly idea are now saying, yes, well, now that I think about it, Me Too tells us, I think Me Too tells us many things, but it didn't tell us that Bill Clinton should leave office. My opinion. But so we are, because this is a Puritan culture, we're always having these sex panics. I'm a big Me Too ardent supporter, in case you think otherwise, but I'm also not a dope. So that's one, and the other is the question of representation. So representation is the stories that we tell ourselves and the way we picture the meaning of life, what, you know, how we construct the world as a world. It's the life world, and we people it with things and objects that we find meaningful and that form our habitus. That can't go away because we are not pre-verbal anymore. And so we construct the world through language. And as Semiotics of the Kitchen is trying to suggest, when you can forget that people think it's just about an angry woman, that it's about the construction of self through language. That's why it's called semiotics, even though it's not a semiotics, it's a vocabulary. But I never ask people to produce a full account of what I'm thinking. And yet, if you ask me, I will tell you this, that these questions of narrativity are essential, because how else do we know who we need to be? How else do children learn what adults are supposed to do and say and dress? So that is representation, but also the stories that are told about various actors on the world stage, the public stage. So these things will continue to obsess me because they make up our world, and especially now the relation between privacy, which we no longer recognize as a viable idea at all, at the same time that we think we're trying to preserve our privacy. What we mean is data, the data that allows people to grab our money and our access and resources, but that's not self. I hope that was somehow illuminating. I just want to agree that you're right to point to those things as being essential.
I'm afraid I'm going to steal your mic.
The hook.
Thank you very much. Amazing, fascinating lecture. Engaging. Thanks again. Thanks all of you for coming.